Who has been hiding behind the curtains in all the American wars? Black soldiers. They have never really been noticed for their work they've done in the Civil War or any other wars. In 1862, President Lincoln allowed black soldiers to enlist. There were over 14 regiments of only African American soldiers. The most known regiment was the 54th. Black soldiers were a very big part for the reason the North won this heroic war. The biggest contributors in the Civil War have never really been noticed. Frederick Douglass previously said, "Once let the black man get upon his persons the brass letter. U.S. let him get an eagle on his button, and musket on his shoulder, and a bullet in his pocket. There is no earth that can deny that he has earned his right to citizenship." After hearing that, the blacks got very motivated, but were still not allowed to partake in the war. There were two acts that passed allowing African Americans to enlist. The first one happened in July, but the blacks were still not allowed to partake in the war. Of September of the same year, the news finally hit Fort Sumner about the Emancipation Proclamation shortly after free black men enrolled in the United States military. In May of 1863, the Bureau of Colored Troops was inaugurated, and the numbers of African Americans entering the U.S. military skyrocketed. Once the Union was using black soldiers for Confederate officers from Tennessee decided it was a fair idea to have African slaves have freedom, only if they fought and outlived the gruesome battles. Later on, Clam's idea had came to the surface. Once the South started to land and the North was taking over, the South believed the only way to win the war was to give slaves weapons and train them for the upcoming battles they would be facing. Soon there was a difficult change that could possibly make a bordering states want to withdraw. President Lincoln wanted to allow the black troops to recruit for the army. On average, 180,000 African Americans enrolled in the army, and many more enlisted in the Navy. By August 1863, 14 Negro regiments were in the fields and were ready for service. Many volunteers entered the regiment from all over, from South Carolina to Massachusetts. It didn't matter where the men were free or running away slaves. They enlisted to fight for their freedom. Recruiting was a challenge until Frederick Douglass encouraged the soldiers by ensuring they would soon have full citizenship. In the military, it didn't matter if a person was from the North or the South. There was still racial discrimination and hatred against the black men. Many isolated parts of the regiment of Negro soldiers were usually under the command of white officers, and some black officers. Most white men believed that the black didn't have the nerve to fight or even thrive at what they were doing. With that statement, the black regiment never had the chance to stand up and prove them wrong. The blacks had known from the beginning of the Confederate Army there would still be prisoners, and the blacks' punishment would be way worse than the white. Nothing compared to the blacks, even though the blacks didn't know how to fight and didn't come off as a threat. Even though blacks were discriminated and brutally abused, they served their country with pride in many of the battles. General Blunt wrote, "I never saw such fighting as was done by the Negro regiment. The question that Negroes will fight is settled, because they were better soldiers in every respect than any troops I have ever had under my command." Having that said, many people allowed the blacks to take part. July 18th, 1863, was the Battle of the Fort Wagner, South Carolina, fought by the 54th Regiment. This battle is what African soldiers were known for. In the North, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the first African American regiment was the 54th, Child of Massachusetts. It was created. A white man who went by the name of Robert Shaw was the commander of the 54th. Shaw had a very huge role commanding the black. He knew they would have an effect on his country, even though Shaw knew he would be discriminated against, hated, and even abused for being the head leader of a black regiment. He didn't care. He knew that to have them be successful, his men needed to trust him and needed to stand by his side. Men from all over the country enlisted in the 54th. Most of the men were from the North, some from the South, and even others from Canada. Since the men came from all over the country to fight, some were never slaves, while others had been slaveries since they were born. Shaw was under the circumstance a public speaker to reveal the news of the blacks enlist in the war. So instead of having him tell everybody about it, the government hired publicity to tell everybody the news. From others spreading the word, many people entered applications from entering in the 54th Regiment. Most of the men who were accepted from the North, New Bedford, Massachusetts, the African American men entered the colossal commitment, understood that not one of them would have the same dealing as another white man would have once they have been captured. Many felt offended knowing they once were not able to serve in war. They had no anxiety knowing they would be shot or forced into slavery. They wanted to serve for the United States and stand against slavery. They were not fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for the new black people coming into the city or into the United States. They were fighting for their freedom. From July 13th to July 16th, in New York City, there was a huge uprising, causing the law that stated, any man can evade any conscription if he pays a substitute to take his place. Many of both races thought this was an outrage and immediately started to attack. Some thought it would have been wiser to attack the legislature for making a conscription act, but they took it out on the blacks. The soldiers of the 54th entered hand-to-hand warfare and were sent back to the harsh injuries. However, they didn't stop them. Shaw led his armed men across the land to the next battle, followed by with a lot of encouragement. Along the way, police officers were nearby in case of the outbreak of the spectators, but not one of the officers needed. Once the commander assisted and his march started. Not an insulting word was heard or an unkind remark made. Peter Birch started. Former slave Harriet Jacobson watched the regiment pass by. She later wrote, "How my heart swelled with the thought that my poor oppression race were to strike a blow from freedom." On the other hand, there still were citizens who did not approve of what was going on. Many individuals stood there but did not watch as the Union marched by. They would stand there or turn their back and not even acknowledge them. This didn't bother Shaw. He stood proud by his men as they walked through the streets of the town. Black soldiers were not just in the 54th Regiment. They were involved in archery and infantry also. The men not knowing helped the equipment. Many of the black men really didn't have the same thing as the whites. They were only paid $10 a month, and that included their clothing, while white men had it handed to them and didn't have to worry about it. They also didn't understand why they were still being punished not as bad as the white. The curtains have finally been pulled back. The black soldiers have been irrevocably revealed from the black drops from the scene. There is a reason why blacks fought for this country. It was to make a stand for mankind and to show that it's acceptable to be different. It doesn't matter a person's color, religion, or how much money they make. A human is a human. The blacks have always been supporting the Caucasian. They deserve every bit of honor and every bit of honor the whites have. The African American slaves who stood up and became soldiers were the reason why the North won the Civil War in the 1800s.